Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Bach, and I'm the director of UCAN's endurance business. I also happen to be your case study for this event, so you'll hear more about my background later. I'm honored to have the great Bob Seebohar with us today. Bob was the Olympic dietitian for the U.S. triathlon team in Beijing. He's a registered sports dietitian, an endurance coach, and an accomplished athlete himself. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much, Matt. This is going to be great chatting about this today.
Yeah, I always get excited to do events with you, Bob, because you're just such an amazing head on your shoulders. You really understand everything, and you understand the depths of the science, but you're able to make it very, very relatable and easy to understand for people. So again, very excited to be working with you again today on this.
Thank you.
So to give everyone an idea of what to expect, I'm going to ask Bob some questions, and Bob will present on how to eat for optimal health and performance. And then I'm going to serve myself up as a case study of how big an impact performance nutrition can make, and specific to metabolic efficiency training and UCAN, two different concepts that you may not have heard of before and may not be very well educated in what they are, but by the end of tonight, you'll very much understand what they are and why they're so compelling for triathletes and cyclists. Before we get started on tonight's discussion, Bob, tell us a bit more about your background.
Yeah, so I've been around the block. I've been a registered dietitian for 19 years now, and in addition to being a registered sport dietitian, I'm also an exercise physiologist, strength and conditioning coach, and elite performance triathlon coach. So I've been doing this for quite a while, going on about 23, 24 years. I own my own business here in Colorado, Energy Performance, where I do a lot of consultation to athletes regarding nutrition coaching, but I do a lot of testing, physiological testing, and that might play into our conversation today, so we can talk about that metabolic efficiency part of it. But as you can see from the What About Bob slide in front of you, I've been around the block. I've been blessed to work with a bunch of great athletes from recreational all the way to pro, Olympic, elite level. And, I love sharing education. I've got quite a few books out to educate people, but that's what I love to do. I love working with athletes, love educating, and I love bringing this, like you were saying, Matt, kind of the science to real life.
Move on here. So one of the things that I'm intrigued about, I mean, this term metabolic efficiency training, where did it come from? Is this something that you created, and where did this come from? Why did you make this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story and this is one part why it's so interesting, is because it is now 16 or 17 years old. Literally, this is how long this concept has been in creation now, and it's still being honed in on and kind of refined, if you will. But back in the early 2000s, I was doing a lot of consultations for a lot of endurance athletes, cyclists, Ironman athletes, and found that there was a lot of issues in addition to weight loss, which is always a challenge when it comes to athletes and body composition changes. The athletes I was working with tended to have a little bit more GI distress. So gastrointestinal distress, diarrhea, vomiting, bloating during racing, sometimes during training. And this is where the metabolic efficiency training story really started, because I myself, as an endurance athlete, suffered horribly from GI distress in my early stages of my recreational career. And I wanted to try to find out if there was a way to stop that. And what I did was I went back to the research. I've got a couple of graduate degrees, exercise physiology, nutrition, and I'm akin to quite a few research and science protocols. So I went through the research, I went through all the textbooks again, and you name it. And I was trying to come up with and answer the question, is there a link between nutrition, exercise, and exercise intensity and GI distress? And lo and behold, obviously, what I came up with was creating this metabolic efficiency training concept. Now, this is where it's different. So a lot of people refer to this as fat adaptation, fat burning, carbohydrate restoration. I mean, you name it. It's got a whole bunch of different names, but metabolic efficiency training really was born in the early to mid 2000s to try to solve the problem of getting rid of GI distress in athletes. However, nowadays, what we've known over the past 16 years, what I've come to realize, there are some pretty significant positive impacts to health. So improving blood sugar control, improving HbA1c for people maybe with prediabetes, you name it. But everything stems, when it comes to metabolic efficiency training, everything stems on how do we optimize blood sugar through nutrition. And that's the concept. And that's really the foundation of this concept. It's nothing crazy in terms of weird training methods or methodologies. It's really looking at how do we look at carbs, protein, and fat, both in a daily nutrition and also in a nutrient timing or a sport nutrition product envelope, and say, how do we optimize blood sugar? Because if we can do that, not only can we get rid of GI distress, but we can improve our performance. We can improve our body composition, our body weight, our sleep patterns, we can actually reduce our risk for certain diseases. So that's kind of the backstory, the quick backstory. There's a little bit more to it, but that's what you see on this graph here is really looking at metabolic efficiency from a picture standpoint, right? So I don't know, Matt, do you want me to discuss kind of what we're seeing on our slide here?
Yeah, please just briefly describe that, and then I want to make a couple points that kind of back up what
absolutely.
you're talking about.
So the first thing you should notice, and for all of you listening, please remember that I affectionately named this term metabolic efficiency training, because metabolic efficiency really means, obviously the foundation is how do we improve blood sugar through nutrient status, carbohydrate, protein, and fat. But really, we're trying to look at a non-diet approach. And what this does, metabolic efficiency training, it allows us not to follow a diet. And you can see on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of this graph, on the left-hand side, we have LCHF, low carb, high fat, and keto diets. And on the right, we have HCLF, high carb, low fat diets. So those are specific diets that a small portion of the population may follow in terms of athletes. But the majority of metabolic efficiency training falls right in the middle of the bell-shaped curve. And it allows, this is why I developed it, it allows to periodize the nutrition based on training load, health goals, body weight goals, body composition goals, and honestly, if you're training for short course versus long course. So that's why it sits upon this, what I call nutrition periodization, because it allows you to factor in if days or months, weeks, if you need more or less carbohydrate, more or less protein, more or less fat. So there's a lot of wiggle room here. And that's the beauty of metabolic efficiency training, because it fits with any athlete. I mean, anybody, male, female, doesn't matter, age, activity, sport, it absolutely doesn't matter.
And that perfectly drives home one of the points that I wanted to make, was that it's a balanced approach that works, and it's not extreme. So there's a lot of extreme fad kind of things out there, that fad diets and things that people tout the benefits of, but this is very much a balanced, well-rounded approach. And as I think many people have experienced in life, like a balanced approach tends to work a lot better than some of the more extreme approaches with their drawbacks. So this, and the reason why I came, and you'll hear more about this in a little bit, is the reason why I came to metabolic efficiency training in the first place was the same reason that you did, which was for GI distress. I was suffering GI distress like crazy in some of my Ironman events in particular. And metabolic efficiency training, along with UCAN, helped to completely cure that. And what you mentioned about how it also has impact on health, like, to me, that wasn't top of mind whatsoever. But over the course of several years of employing this philosophy of metabolic efficiency training, I found that from a health standpoint, it was also beneficial.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that athletes usually forget, right? And I think both of us as athletes, certain times in our life, we don't really put health on the pedestal, we put performance. But I think that's what really matters, is combining those two and looking at, well, if you follow a diet, that's not necessarily a healthy long-term approach. If you follow a concept, and this is why I named it metabolic efficiency training, because athletes follow a training plan. They should also follow a nutrition plan, not a diet per se. Like you don't follow a training diet, right? You shouldn't follow a nutritional diet either.
So let's move on to the slide here. So, why metabolic efficiency training? You touched on several of these points. Anything else you want to kind of reiterate or add here?
Yeah, let me just hone in on number 2. So our body stores carbohydrate and fat. So we store an abundant amount of fat, like tens of thousands of calories. And most individuals, age groupers, we can store 60, 70, 80,000 calories worth of fat in our bodies. Carbohydrate, though, we're very limited. And depending on your gender and your size, so if you are a large male, you will store upwards of probably around 2,000 calories of carbohydrate. If you're a small petite female, probably around 1,200 to 1,400 calories. So if you contrast what we store, very low storage of carbohydrate, to very high storage of fat, it makes sense to try. And this is what I was going through 16, 17 years ago, asking the question, well, if our stores are that different, but we've got so much fat as stores, can we actually teach our body to utilize that fat, kind of tap into that fat reserve to support energy needs? And obviously the answer is yes, but I really want to just make that point across, is that metabolic efficiency training is trying to teach the body to literally burn more fat and preserve carbohydrates. So as athletes, doesn't matter if you're short or long course, right? What we need to do is preserve our carbohydrates until we really need them for the higher intensities, the cat and mouse, going up the hill, finish line sprints, whatever it is, those really hard anaerobic efforts. All the rest of the time, we need to be adapted or better adapted in utilizing our fat reserves. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you touched on the point where, during these higher intensity efforts, these sprints, these finish line, you're using more glycogen. And I think that's a key point too, that when you're operating at a higher intensity, you're using more glycogen versus fat.
Exactly. And here's, if I may throw this out really quick, you can't, like a lot of people and a lot of even researchers still, because they don't understand the testing part of metabolic efficiency and just the whole concept, you can train your body to improve its fat adaptation or fat burning at higher intensity. So as an example, the research, and this is what I pulled when I was first creating this concept, the research states that you start switching over from fat burning, or I should say more fat burning, to more carbohydrate burning at about 63 to 65% of your max VO2 or max heart rate intensity. That's absolutely false. That is old data. That's about 40 or 50-year-old data. What we're finding, and a lot of people are doing this now with metabolic efficiency testing, and this is the protocol that I developed along with this concept to actually test this in a lab, and we'll be seeing that with your case study, Matt. But I've actually documented, I've tested an athlete where he was burning up more fat at 89% of his max VO2. So it is possible, and simply with dietary shifts. So I think that's another important thing, is you don't need to just bang your head on the wall and just do all zone 1 aerobic training. Like, the dietary component of this is about 3/4 of the equation. The aerobic training part is only about 1/4 of the equation.
Yeah, that's key. And I think one other key thing here too is that because this isn't an extreme approach, you preserve your ability to burn carbohydrate and fat. Where some of the extreme approaches, like if you're going all the way down to keto, there's some pretty heated debate out there about how it sort of diminishes your ability to burn carbohydrate. But with metabolic efficiency training, you kind of keep the best of both worlds there, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you're kind of burning the match at both ends, if you will, right? Instead of just one.
Good way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I've actually already covered this right here as far as the fat stores and the carb stores, but.
Yeah, and that'll just give you that numeric value, which I was talking about. We can store up to about 80,000 calories of fat and really limited carbohydrates. So this is a key thing to just hone in on, because if you take nothing from this presentation, or maybe one golden nugget or 2 gold nuggets, remember that we have abundant fat stores, but your body will not give up fat stores to provide energy unless you teach it to do that. Okay, now we can move on.
No, that's great.
Yeah,
and you'll see that very shortly with my with the case study that I'm going to present about my own data, and with the testing, it's pretty remarkable. Yeah. So how do you implement metabolic efficiency training? What are some of these basic concepts?
It's actually pretty easy. I mean, you mentioned keto a little bit earlier, and I got to tell you, keto is rough. Like, it is really hard, because here's the thing, like, if you want to do keto, which is a very restrictive elimination diet, you have to measure your blood ketones. Otherwise, you have no idea if a certain amount of grams of carbohydrate per day is actually pushing you in ketosis. So that, to me, is very laborious. On the other side of it is eating as many carbohydrates as possible in a low-fat diet. Well, we know that actually predisposes a lot of individuals to disease states, and there is a lot of research that is not only supported that, but is also continuing to support that. So what I've wanted to do with metabolic efficiency training is I wanted to make it simple. And the first couple of implementation strategies or dietary strategies that you see here are so simple, it's really not even funny. So this is where I start with everyone. I teach them what I call the carbohydrate to protein ratio, or what I call the hand model. So if you're trying to say, all right, I'm on this metabolic efficiency training thing, this guy's making sense, I want to try to optimize my blood sugar through food, here's where you start. You take both hands, right? The size of your hand is from your wrist to your fingertips. One hand is your carbohydrate hand, right? So that could be your fruits, your veggies, your whole grains, not your refined processed white starches, right? But your whole grains. The other hand is protein, right? So if you and you don't have to count, this is why I made it so simple. And this is actually a qualitative strategy. If you put one hand of carb to one hand of protein, put them together almost every time you eat, you are going to optimize your blood sugar like crazy. What we didn't talk about yet is, why do we need to optimize our blood sugar? We keep on throwing this out. Well, here's the deal. Whenever you have a blood sugar spike, what that does is your body says, whoo, my blood sugar is high. I'm kind of in a danger mode, right? You might be feeling good for a few minutes, but your blood sugar cannot stay high too long. So your body's pancreas secretes this wonderful hormone called insulin. Insulin is actually a wonderful hormone, right? It's not a bad guy like a lot of people point out to be. Insulin reduces your blood sugar, right? So it allows your blood sugar to get a little bit lower, enter the cells. Everything is hunky-dory. You're on your day, right? Everything is good. Except when blood sugar is high and insulin is therefore high, it actually significantly reduces your body's ability to burn fat. So it kind of shuts off your fat burning and revs up your carbohydrate burning. And that's the exact opposite thing that we want to do here when it comes to metabolic efficiency. So by following this hand model, one hand carb, one hand protein, put it together, that's the easiest way to optimize blood sugar. Now, I have introduced other strategies because it kind of depends on the personality type of the athlete, right? So the periodization plates, just briefly, is looking at your plate and strategically putting portions of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, just again to balance blood sugar. The carbohydrate unloading, as you well know, Matt, that is what we use on a lot of endurance athletes who are just crazy carbohydrate addicts, sugar addicts, sugarholics. We need to actually step down. So here's another golden nugget. If you want to try this and you're a high carb guy or girl, don't immediately go dropping your carbohydrate, because you will go through some serious sugar withdrawals. So with the carbohydrate unloading, basically that is taking a 4-week program, and every week you are just reducing your carbohydrates little by little by little. So by week 4, you're kind of at that place that you want to be. That will hopefully avoid you or prevent you from having those sugar withdrawals or those high carbohydrate withdrawals. The number 4 and number 5, those are a little bit more strategic, a little more quantitative based, where we put in some lower carb periodization days, put in some higher fats with the low carb days. We kind of periodize it based on your training. So maybe on the easier days, you can follow a little bit lower carb, high fat, but on the harder days, you follow a little bit more moderate carb, moderate fat. And then the last one is going through periods where if you fat adapt your body, meaning if you do periodize your carbohydrates to be a little bit lower, there's going to be times where you need to restore your carbohydrates, and that's the carbohydrate restoration. So maybe, during taper, you're restoring your carbohydrates. Maybe a couple days before a huge weekend of training, you're restoring your carbohydrates. So by far the easiest one to start with is number 1, and that's why it's number 1, is just that hand model, that carbohydrate to protein ratio.
I use that every day.
Yeah, because it's simple, right? Yeah.
Just always being cognizant of the pairing of the foods. And that's, I think, one of the sort of the keys of metabolic efficiency training, of this philosophy of stabilizing blood sugar, is the fact that if you're pairing those carbohydrates with the carbs, like one of the rules of thumb I try to use is never eat a carb alone. And that's what I do now. What I did in the past, though, I was just, like you said, one of those people who was a high carb. Everybody was telling me, like, you're a runner, you're a triathlete, you're an Ironman athlete. Like, you need to be taking in massive amounts of carbohydrates, huge pasta dinners the night before, and always sort of neglecting taking in the protein and fats that I needed to be taking in. I was just kind of taking huge bowls of pasta with vodka sauce or like marinara sauce.
Exactly.
I needed to be like, taking way down on the pasta and adding in, some chicken and veggies and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it wasn't
unfortunately,
a huge shift, actually.
It's still, unfortunately it's still common to hear that, right? I mean, it's been 20, 30 years since we were really promoting that back then, right? But nowadays I still run across that, and you see the races, or the races that we're still doing the pasta dinners, and you're just like, I always say, God, I hope they have chicken. Like, I hope they have some type of meat or some meatballs or something with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And carbs are important for performance, and you want to make sure you have your glycogen stores topped off, so that at least you do have that 2,000 calories about of glycogen in your system. It doesn't mean like just having 4 massive bowls of pasta alone the night
Right. Yeah.
before.
Yeah. And not every day, right? And that's
Right.
that's the periodization model of this.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So that's actually, I mean, this conversation about blood sugar stabilization and is the perfect segue into UCAN and how it
Mm.
fits in with your approach. Like, why is it something that you recommend to your
It's,
athletes?
UCAN really is revolutionary. And honestly, like I just remember, and I'll share my story a little bit later, but I remember when I was first introduced to UCAN, and, I didn't really believe it until they had the science, which we see now. Once you see science, and it just, like, the numbers don't lie, data doesn't lie, and it just brings it to life. But UCAN, honestly, and this is why I was somewhat relieved, probably, it's been 14, 15 years since I started speaking with UCAN. I'm relieved because there was finally, and there is a finally, sport nutrition product on the market that supports metabolic efficiency training. There never was in the past, because all these products were simple sugar based. They spike blood sugar. Like, they just didn't really match with my metabolic efficiency training concept. So it's super, super exciting to finally see a product that supports not only the performance side of it, but the health side of metabolic efficiency training also.
Mhm. And what Bob's referring to with the science, on this slide you see here, this science is as it pertains to UCAN. And what underlies UCAN is a carbohydrate, a very complex carbohydrate called superstarch. And we'll get into the story in just a bit about how it was discovered. It actually had nothing to do with endurance sports initially. And so we'll be telling that story in a moment. But first, to take a look at this in terms of how it ties in with metabolic efficiency training and this concept of trying to improve health and improve your performance by eliminating GI distress and by having more stable energy levels. This chart illustrates it very nicely, or this segment, this series of charts, really. So the first one you see here is blood sugar, is glucose concentration. And you see in the blue line that spikes up and crashes, that's the profile that you get from maltodextrin. And this is from a study in 2019. And the spike and the crash there is what happens from taking maltodextrin. The red line is what you see from superstarch. So it's like a swell in blood sugar that then releases over a long period of time, a far more stable source of energy. And there's the green line there, that's water as a control point. On what, as Bob described before, when blood sugar spikes, it causes your body to release insulin. And so you see that in the chart on the right, the dotted line is a rise in insulin because of ingesting maltodextrin pre-exercise. And so you see it spikes up, and then you see it post-exercise too, after there was also another dose of maltodextrin. But what you see with that black line that's nearly flatlined at the bottom is from superstarch. So you see that because the blood sugar profile on the left is far more stable, the red line, you see the black line is also nearly muted. And so your insulin levels remain very, very low, which prompts a better rate of fat oxidation or fat burning. So it allows your body to rely more on those nearly unlimited fat stores rather than having to be dependent on glycogen in your body, which is very, very limited. So you see in the red line, that's superstarch, the fat oxidation rate, that's far higher than it is for maltodextrin, the blue line. So the main findings that we have from these studies, from starting back in 2008, 2009, all the way up through when it was discovered, all the way up through 2019, studies have been happening ever since. Blood sugar is far more stable versus maltodextrin. Insulin remains nearly muted. Fat oxidation is improved. Molecular weight is very, very high, and osmolality is very, very low. So that chart in the bottom right-hand corner, or this table, I'm a numbers guy, I love this stuff. So on the bottom right-hand side, how Bob mentioned that most sports nutrition is underlied by simple sugars or maltodextrin, you can see in stark contrast the differences between simple sugars and maltodextrin and superstarch. So, I mean, you name it, whatever brand it is that you've been using or you've heard of in the past, it's almost guaranteed that it's being underlied by one of these things: fructose, glucose, maltodextrin, sucrose, which all have a sort of spike and crash type of profile. And the molecular weight of simple sugars is 180. For maltodextrin, it's a string of glucose molecules. It's considered complex, and it's between 500 and 3,000 grams per mole molecular weight. And superstarch has a molecular weight of about 600,000. So the difference there is absolutely, enormous. The osmolality, therefore, which is how fast something can clear the stomach, is very, very low for superstarch, which is a good thing. It means it clears the stomach very, very quickly, and it helps prevent things like bloating, stomach aches, sloshing. To some degree, it could help with like reflux and nauseousness and vomiting. and it can help with reducing diarrhea and things like porta potty stops that you don't want to be making. Whereas the osmolality of simple sugars and maltodextrin drinks and gels tend to be far higher, pretty high osmolality, which means that it requires lots and lots of transporters, which is water, to transport it through the stomach and into the gut. And therefore it sits in the stomach and sloshes around a lot. So if you were ever just chug an entire sports drink, sugary sports drink, and then you know what would happen. It would sit in your stomach and it would bother it. It would slosh around. It would take a while for it to drain, sort of, not drain, but be absorbed by the body. So that's not the case with UCAN because of this breakthrough in carbohydrate technology called superstarch. Bob, do you have anything to add on the science piece before I move on?
I would just say from a practical standpoint, superstarch UCAN has really allowed me as a practitioner to help athletes dose a little bit differently. So because the molecular weight is so high, like you said, it empties the stomach so quickly, but then it absorbs the small intestine very slowly. So it's that slow burning energy. You've got a lot of energy longer term. Out are the days, I remember back in my Ironman days, I used to, we were taking gels and sugar every 15 to 20 minutes, right? Because that's what we needed to do. Nothing said differently. With this, though, it allows me to dose UCAN about every 60 to 90 minutes. And that is, if you're an athlete listening to this, honestly, it should be music to your ears. One, from a practical standpoint, and two, from just not overloading your gut. And that allows you to ride, to swim, to bike, to run a lot more effectively. So I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely one of the big benefits is the simplicity of it. Being able to take in fewer calories because of something like metabolic efficiency training and or UCAN. Being able to take in fewer calories, rely more on your fat stores is a huge benefit. During my Ironman events, I used to be targeting, like you said, around 300 calories an hour of sugar, which actually I'll get right to that story right now. Perfect. Another perfect segue. So I used to be targeting 300 calories an hour of sugary products, and you name it, I tried it. I went far and wide trying to find every product out there that I could that thought it might make a difference. And it went right back. I didn't know it at the time, but it went right back to the fact that they're all underlied by basically the same simple sugars and maltodextrin, high glycemic carbohydrates. And I was having stomach problems, big GI distress problems, unplanned porta potty stops, and just disastrous for my performances. So I did 4 Ironman events in 2012, 2013. And in all 4 of those events, I had GI distress that led to bonking. Because at some point, the first gel went down great. The 7th gel was like, oh, this is tough. I can't get it down. And the 5th bottle of sugary sports drink, it was like, nope, can't do it, even though the first one went down fine. And so I'm like, oh, I have all the stomach aches. I'm just nauseated by looking at another gel. And so I'd start throwing my nutrition aside. And I'm sure this is a very common story to you, Bob. You've probably heard this 1,000 times from all your athletes. But I started throwing it aside. And then because I'm throwing the nutrition aside and I stopped taking it in, or say early in the marathon, lo and behold, 45 minutes later, I'm bonking. So I found myself multiple times during my Ironman events bonking and having GI distress, bonking usually around mile 15, maybe 18, somewhere around there, and really suffering from a performance standpoint, many minutes or even tens of minutes. And it was holding me back. So I was still performing fairly well. I was able to, break 10 hours at Ironman Lake Placid in my debut. I went to Kona the following year. And so I was able to qualify, but I was still, I had a lot of potential, but I was definitely not reaching my potential. Right. So then it was in 2014 that I reached out to a sports nutritionist, somebody who's learned from you, one of your metabolic efficiency training specialists. Her name is Nikki Schock. I reached out to her and I said, I'm having all sorts of problems. Like, I know that you're now a nutritionist. What is this metabolic efficiency training? And so she explained it to me. And for 2 weeks, I tried punching holes in it. I'm like, no, this can't possibly be applicable to me. Like, no way. There's no way people are doing Ironman in under 100 calories an hour. Like, that's definitely not for me. Trying to punch holes in it. And then eventually after 2 weeks, I was like, all right, like I'm having a tough time here punching holes. So let me just try it. Like, hey, I'm going to go wholeheartedly into it. And let's just see what happens. So that's when I did a metabolic efficiency test right before I started working with her and making any sort of those dietary changes that you were talking about before. And you can see it's the sort of more grayed out lines are the 2 lines from my first test. And you see this one here is fat. And as you can see, as the intensity level increases, the fat oxidation goes down, or actually it's the fat percentage that goes down. And the carbohydrate percentage goes up. And you see there's a crossover point here at right around 709 pace. and my goal Ironman pace was 6:45. And so you can see right here that I was burning about 60% fat or 60% carbohydrate and 40% fat at this intensity. And then after 5 weeks of implementing metabolic efficiency training principles, I had moved that crossover point out to 6:23 pace. And at goal Ironman race pace, my fat oxidation had improved dramatically. And I was burning 60% fat and 40% carbohydrate at Ironman race pace. What that meant for me is instead of having to target 300 calories an hour, only actually achieving 230 calories an hour and bonking and having GI distress, instead, I was able to take in 94 calories an hour and have no GI distress and no bonking issues. This is also using UCAN and won Ironman Maryland. So this was an absolutely mind-blowing moment for me, the fact that metabolic efficiency training and UCAN could make such an impact on my performance, overall on my performance. I mean, my nutritional experience in that race was absolutely night and day from what I had experienced prior to that, because of the fact that I was more metabolically efficient and didn't have to rely so much on other sources of calories. And also because I was using UCAN. And between the two of those, I had no GI distress, no bonking issues, and had to consume fewer calories and was yet able to perform at a huge level above where I was. I ran a 20-minute PR off the bike, ran 3 flat. I had a 51-minute PR overall in the race. And as you can see, I won the race overall. So that was like my UCAN moment, my metabolic efficiency training moment.
And you have a smile on your face too.
Yep. And I have dogs in the background. Oh, the joys of COVID. But yeah, a smile on my face for sure. And it was amazing because I had such a robust belief in my, robust enough belief in my nutritional approach in that race. I knew at mile 5, like, I'm going to win this race because I was gaining on the people ahead of me. And I knew for some reason, I just knew like, I'm not going to have nutritional problems today.
Yeah.
I didn't have any of that threatening GI distress.
Yeah. So I think that's, if I can really quickly, like you used a very quantitative testing model. Like, I mean, that's the protocol for metabolic efficiency. And you actually applied that into your training. Like, and that's one thing that you didn't mention, but like you probably spent months, like refine that after you received that data from Nikki, you actually refined that during your training, right? And kind of taught yourself and figured out your strategy. And that's another one of the success markers that you had to win Ironman Maryland, right? And I think that's right. It's a good thing to just, because I need to remind athletes, you don't just, eat 1-to-1 and put UCAN in there. Like, you also have to like go through the process and the months of adapting to it, but also making sure that it fits in your training, your long bike rides, your long runs, like whatever it is, just making sure you get it down to really to the science of when do you dose UCAN? Like, what am I doing for breakfast? And just everything under the umbrella.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I was spending those, it was about 3 months before I did Ironman Maryland when I started implementing metabolic efficiency training and started using UCAN. And so I was trialing and erroring the whole time, kind of experimenting with what's working, what's the right dosage for me. And everybody's individual. So everybody has to figure out exactly what works for them. And I was finding out what's the right dosage, what's the right timing, which flavors do I like the best? Like all these different little things that I was just kind of experimenting with. In my training and in my simulation days, so that I could make sure that I operated and executed right on race day.
Yep.
And that's of course for any sports nutrition or any approach. Like, you obviously want to be trialing and error, but especially if you're trying something new like this.
Yeah.
And this is a perfect time to try something new, by the way. I mean, it's October right now. It is the perfect time. There's no races, this year for the most part. Most people are kind of looking forward to 2021. So take advantage of this time to try something new.
Exactly.
So I promised to tell the origins of where it came from, because I mentioned that Superstarch did not come from a mission to, say, make money off endurance athletes. It didn't have that mission at all. And initially it was because of this kid, Jonah. And I'll briefly tell you, how this came to be. So back in the early 2000s, Jonah Feldman was born with a rare metabolic disorder called glycogen storage disease. And what this disease means for him and all the other kids like him that have this disease is that they can't process glycogen the same way that we can. They can't create their own blood glucose to keep their blood sugar levels stable. And so, like anybody, if their blood sugar levels drop to low levels, they could have seizures and die. So it's life-threatening. It's very dangerous. And a lot of these kids wouldn't live very long, years and years ago, before they knew how to manage it. And so in the 1970s, they discovered a way just using Argo cornstarch from the grocery store to manage it and to keep these kids alive at a higher rate. But it was very, very difficult for them to live because of the fact that they had to take Argo cornstarch every 2 to 3 hours, even through the night. And if they missed a feeding, then they would die. So it's very, very stressful for the parents. Everybody's sleep deprived. Jonah and the kids like him are not living normal lives. So in the 2000s, when Jonah was born, his family said, hey, there's got to be some better way to do this. And maybe there's something that we can harness, some new technology, something that we can create or fund research to find a cure or a better way to manage glycogen storage disease. And what ultimately happened in 2008, they found a team of Scottish researchers who had discovered a way to take a certain species or strain of corn, create cornstarch and cook the cornstarch through a 40-hour heating process, just using heat and water. And it's a polymerization process. So it creates this epic long molecule that we talked about before with the 600,000 molecular weight. Right? It takes normal cornstarch it has a molecular weight of about 700. And so it polymerizes this into this massive complex molecule that then for kids like Jonah, they can take the equivalent of 2 servings of superstarch before they go to bed and sleep through the night for 8 hours straight. So it gives them energy for 10 hours. And nothing on earth had given them that before. So that was really like the first piece of validation that this is truly something new and different and revolutionary, that this could be fed to kids like Jonah with this medical condition, and it could actually make this massive impact on their lives. This was like a huge sigh of relief for the Feldman family and for Jonah. At age 9, he was finally able to sleep through the night for the very first time without having to be fed in the middle of the night multiple times. And so that was that first piece of validation. The second piece of validation, or one of the next pieces of validation, came from you, Bob, because they approached you. And maybe I'll kick it over to you to sort of tell the rest of the story here.
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember in 2006. I was still at University of Florida, and I was actually making my way back to Colorado to the United States Olympic Committee. And I remember Peter Kaufman, one of the founders of UCAN, had contacted me and said, hey, we've got this product. What do you think? And sports dietitian, I get these calls just about once a week from companies saying, hey, we want you to look at our product. What about this? What about that? And as we were, so I was kind of giving it like a low brush off. But as we were talking, I thought, I told him, I remember telling Peter this, I said, if what you're saying is actually true, this could literally revolutionize the way I work with athletes and really probably revolutionize the entire sport nutrition industry. And I got a little excited, but I was like, hey, you know what? You don't have research yet. Why don't you come back? Let's revisit this when you have a little bit of research, knowing that when I say that, most companies, they go completely dark and they never revisit it, right? But then I think it was, about a year later, he presented me with the research, that initial study, and it got me super excited because now he was kind of backing up. He was able to back up kind of what he was talking about. So that's where I started my UCAN journey. And like you said, this is when they were not even thinking about entering the sport nutrition market. It was just a question of, do you think this might be beneficial? It was helping Jonah. Do you think it might be beneficial for athletes? And I jumped on board and said, absolutely. If it works, if you can actually validate it, then 100% this will change everything in the sport nutrition field.
Yeah. And they gave you some to try with yourself and your athletes. And that was like further validation.
Further validate. I mean, at that point there was only plain, and it was a little bit tough to get down, because I would take it out on the trails, out on my bike, like wherever, and it was a little bit tough to get down. But like I was putting it to the test. Like I had a blood sugar meter with me, and I would poke my finger, like all these different things. And again, because I needed to validate it too. I'm like, okay, if research says it, yes, absolutely. But sometimes you don't know the subject, the sample, like all that stuff. But I was like, even though it was N of 1, but I had my other athletes doing it. The blood sugar meter, the constant, sticking in my finger after consuming UCAN while exercising, that was it. Like that sold me right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
amazing. And then at that point, it was 2012 or so when the company, as you know it now, was formed to cater initially to athletes. Who else wants long-lasting energy, easy on the stomach, stable blood sugar, and it seemed pretty clear that endurance athletes could certainly benefit from this breakthrough in carbohydrate technology.
Yeah.
So I'm only very briefly going to describe the how here because I want to wrap things up, but how do you implement UCAN into your approach? One of the main things here, the big rule of thumb, 1 serving equals 1 scoop equals 1 packet equals 1 hour. So 1 serving of UCAN, and this is very much a rule of thumb, should sustain you for about 1 hour. You're going to find some folks who are maybe more fat adapted, maybe are smaller athletes, maybe are, there's a whole plethora of factors that goes into this. And that's why nutrition is such an individual thing. But this rule of thumb is a good starting point. So take 1 serving and it should last you about 1 hour. And the way that you'll typically take it is before your activity, because it releases over the course of a very long period of time, several hours. You can actually take this before your runs. You can take this before your bike rides, and it'll last for up to 1 serving will last 60 to 90 minutes. If you take multiple servings before you go out, which you can actually do, it'll last you for 2 to maybe even up to 3 or maybe even more hours, depending on how much you take and all those other factors. Once you get over about 2.5, 3 hours, is, at least for me and for many of the people that I speak with, is about the point where you'll want to preload, but then also take some on the road with you. So if you're a cyclist or a triathlete, or you're doing a big brick or whatever it might be, then you take about a serving an hour. And again, it might be a serving and a half per hour. It might be a serving every 2 hours. It might be a serving every 90 minutes. So you kind of have to dial that in based off of your own metabolic system. Let's see, if higher intensities, you want to take a bit more because you are burning more glycogen, so you need to replace more of what you're expending. And then some mixing tips. You'll notice that this is different. Like it's more like a shake than it is a transparent fluid, like what you might be used to. And so you'll just like you would with something like a protein shake, you're going to mix put water in the bottle. You're going to add the powder. You're going to shake it vigorously, and then top it off and shake it again. And then this is one key thing. If you stick it in the fridge the night before, it helps dissolve it so that the next morning when you get to it, it's that much smoother and that much more delicious. Mm-hmm. And some final things to note here is that UCAN can be used because of these blood sugar, this stabilization of blood sugar can be used in daily life as well. So this could be used for curbing hunger. The bars are fantastic for snacks. They're delicious, and they're just a healthier version of snacks that you can take to help stabilize your blood sugar, rather than snacking on maybe chips and cookies or whatever that might be spiking your blood sugar and causing you to have this cyclical kind of roller coaster where you become hungry and then you eat carbs and then you spike your blood sugar and then you become hungry and you eat carbs again, and you have this endless cycle where you're just overeating. I'm not going to dwell too long on here because I just want to wrap things up for everybody and be cognizant of everybody's time. But we are raffling off some UCAN, and want to make sure that you guys are aware of a code that we've arranged with Felt. This is an event exclusive to the Felt and UCAN audience. And so there's a code here that you can use for 20% off. Actually, that's a typo there. It's not off your first order. It's actually 20% off flat. So go ahead and use that code FELT and at ucan.co, which is our website. And here's the family of products that you can see here. So the tubs that you see here are the superstarch products that we've been referring to, along with the bars here. They also have the superstarch. And Hydrate has no superstarch in it. It has electrolytes. It's a clean, natural energy electrolyte source. So our contact information is here too if you have questions, and feel free to throw your questions into the chat and we can answer them as well. I think that's it for now. So Bob, do you have anything to add or before we wrap up?
I just echo what you said. A lot of people look at sport nutrition products as just using during training. I think that's another real separator of UCAN, is like you mentioned in the previous slide, that I've got so many athletes fighting the snack cravings and all this stuff, where I actually have them use UCAN during the day. And I think it's the powder or the bars to help control and optimize blood sugar. So I'd like to leave and just kind of reiterate that this is a product that you can trust to stabilize and optimize your blood sugar, because it doesn't have any simple sugars, but you can trust to put it within your daily nutrition plan in addition to training nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point to emphasize, because you would never take a gel, let's say at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because you're feeling low.
Exactly.
But you could reach for a bar, or you could reach for one of these shakes to take you to dinner time. And it's a healthy option for that. Absolutely. Well, excellent. So your email address is there in case people have any questions, and you can follow us on the social media. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope you learned something new here. I hope you found this to be interesting. Feel free to reach out with any questions. I love it. If you can't tell, Bob and I are both extremely passionate about nutrition and endurance sports. And so thank you so much for coming on, Bob, and sharing your infinite wisdom. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I appreciate it. Have a good night, everyone.